The UNSC frigate Midpoint Resolve had been holding a low orbital position above Sigma Octanus IV for 11 hours when its sensor array registered something that the ship's AI, a third-generation tactical intelligence named Prussian, flagged as a sensor malfunction, and then, 40 seconds later, reclassified as a confirmed anomaly requiring immediate command escalation. What the sensors had detected was a human biological signature on the surface of a continent that UNSC Ground Command had classified as completely overrun by Covenant forces 14 hours earlier, a continent from which no UNSC personnel had successfully extracted, and from which no distress signals had been received since the Covenant's initial landing push had fragmented the ground defense network into silence. The signature was not distress. It was not stationary. It was moving at a pace that Prussian's mobility modeling flagged as inconsistent with any known human athletic capacity, through terrain that the Covenant had saturated with active combat units, and the Covenant units it was moving through were not pursuing it. They were not doing anything at all, in the specific and permanent way of things that have been conclusively stopped. Whatever was moving through that continent had not been stopped by anything the Covenant had put in front of it, and it was still moving, and the direction it was moving was toward the largest Covenant ground installation on the planet. You think you know how the human-Covenant war ends. You don't. Not this version. Subscribe now, because what begins as an anomalous sensor reading above Sigma Octanus IV becomes something that changes the shape of an interstellar war in ways that neither humanity nor the Covenant will ever fully recover from. Sigma Octanus IV had been a colony world of moderate strategic importance before the Covenant arrived, which in the context of the human-Covenant war meant it had been important enough to defend, and not important enough to guarantee the resources required to defend it successfully. The Covenant's initial landing push had been textbook in its brutality. A coordinated atmospheric insertion, supported by plasma bombardment from orbit that had fragmented the UNSC ground defense network within the first 6 hours, and pushed the surviving elements of 3 Marine battalions into a series of increasingly untenable defensive positions in the planet's northern continent. By the time the Midpoint Resolve had assumed its orbital monitoring position, the ground situation had already resolved itself into the specific, grim arithmetic of a losing engagement. Too many Covenant units, too little UNSC response capability, not enough time. The evacuation order had been issued. The northern continent had been written off, and then Prussian sensors had found the biological signature moving through the middle of it, toward the Covenant, in the wrong direction entirely. Saitama had arrived on Sigma Octanus IV the way he arrived most places, which was without planning, without context, and without a clear understanding of how he had gotten there from wherever he had been before. He had a general impression of having been in the middle of something, a training session, possibly, or a walk. The memory was vague in the way that memories of transitions tend to be vague. And then he had been somewhere else, which was the surface of a planet that was immediately and obviously not the surface of any planet he had been to before. The sky was the wrong color, a deep greenish-gray that suggested an atmosphere with different composition than he was used to, and the gravity was slightly lighter than he expected, which he noticed in the way you notice a step that is slightly shorter than your stride has anticipated. The landscape around him was a dense forest that had been partially destroyed by what looked like extremely large explosions, with burned sections and areas of secondary fire still generating smoke that rose into the greenish sky in thick, moving columns. Saitama had looked at all of this with the patient, assessing expression of someone trying to establish the basic facts of an unfamiliar situation, and had concluded that wherever this was, it was currently having some kind of significant problem. The first Covenant patrol had found him approximately 8 minutes after his arrival, which was less a product of search effort, and more a product of the fact that the patrol happened to be moving through the same section of damaged forest, and encountered him standing in a cleared area looking at the sky with his hands in his pockets, apparently evaluating the color of the atmosphere with the mild, curious attention of someone who has just noticed something slightly unusual about the weather. The patrol was 12 grunts and 2 elites, operating as a standard sweep unit tasked with confirming that the cleared northern zone had no remaining UNSC personnel. They had confirmed this zone after zone, efficiently and without incident, for the past several hours. They had not expected to find a short human in a yellow jumpsuit standing in the middle of their sweep area looking at the sky. The elites raised their plasma rifles. The grunts raised their plasma pistols. The combined firepower represented a level of destructive capability that would have been comprehensively fatal to any unarmored human being in the history of the UNSC's conflict with the Covenant. The plasma fire lasted approximately 4 seconds. It struck Saitama with full accuracy across multiple points of contact, because 12 grunts and 2 elites firing simultaneously at a stationary target at close range is not a scenario that produces many misses. The plasma impacted and dispersed and achieved nothing that could be meaningfully described as damage, and Saitama's response was to look down at his jumpsuit with the specific, evaluating expression of someone checking for stains, find none of particular concern, and look back up at the patrol with the mild, slightly puzzled expression of someone trying to determine the purpose of an activity they don't fully understand. He said, to the patrol generally and to no one in particular, that he was not sure what was happening here but that he had questions, and asked whether anyone present spoke a language he would be able to follow. The elite on the left of the patrol made a sound that Saitama could not interpret, but that contained, in its register and cadence, a quality he recognized from every language he didn't speak, which was the quality of alarm. Then it charged him, energy sword igniting in the specific, pressurized way of Covenant energy blade technology engaging at full output, and Saitama sighed, very quietly, with the tone of someone who was hoping the conversation would go differently, and caught the blade with one hand, and looked at it, and set it aside, and flicked the elite once in the center of its chest, and the elite described an arc through the air that ended approximately 40 meters away at the base of a burned tree. And the remaining patrol members experienced the specific, collective stillness of a group that has just watched its most capable member become a projectile. Saitama looked at the remaining patrol and then looked in the direction he had been facing before they arrived, which appeared to be north, and decided that north was as good a direction as any other until he had more information and started walking. The patrol did not follow him. 3 of the grunts ran in the opposite direction, which was the most tactically coherent response available to them, and the remaining members stayed very still and watched him go. And the elite that had survived the encounter by not being the one who charged sat against the burned tree and transmitted a contact report to Covenant Field Command that contained descriptions of what had just happened and that would, within the hour, produce a level of consternation in the Covenant's Sigma Octanus Field Command structure that no UNSC action in the previous 14 hours of fighting had managed to generate. Above the planet, Prussian tracked the biological signature as it resumed its northward movement and updated her anomaly report with new data, including the observation that the Covenant sweep units in the signature's path were ceasing to register as active contacts at a rate, and in a pattern that her tactical modeling could not account for with any known variable. She flagged the updated report to the Midpoint Resolve's commanding officer with a priority level she had never used before, and included a note that said, in the precise and careful language of a military AI declining to overstate its conclusions, that she was not currently able to explain what she was seeing, and that she believed this was important. Commander Yale Ostrander had been in command of the Midpoint Resolve for 2 years, which was long enough in the Human Covenant War to have developed the specific, functional relationship with bad news that sustained officers in extended conflict. The ability to receive terrible information, process it quickly, and convert it into action without the intermediate step of emotional response slowing the conversion. She had received Prussia's priority flag while reviewing the evacuation logistics for the southern continent's remaining marine elements, and she had read the updated anomaly report twice before calling Prussian directly and asking her, with the flat economy of someone who does not have time for circumlocution, what she was actually looking at. Prussian told her. She described the biological signature, its movement pattern, its pace, and the progressive cessation of Covenant active contacts along its path. And then she said, in the careful and slightly unusual phrasing that Ostrander had come to recognize as Prussian's way of indicating that she was about to say something her own analytical framework found uncomfortable, that the contact cessation pattern was consistent with a single entity engaging and neutralizing Covenant sweep units sequentially, and that the engagement duration per unit, based on the timestamps of the contact losses, was averaging approximately 3 to 4 seconds. Ostrander asked her to repeat the last figure. Prussian repeated it. Ostrander looked at the tactical display for a moment and then asked how many Covenant units had been lost. Prussian told her the current count was 47 and that the number was increasing while they were speaking. The figure was significant enough that Ostrander did something she had not done since the early days of her command, which was call her senior staff to the bridge without a scheduled reason, simply because the thing she was looking at required more cognitive resources than she wanted to apply to it alone. Her XO, a steady and analytical officer named Lieutenant Commander Ferris, arrived first and reviewed the display and said nothing for a moment, and then said that the movement pattern looked like a UNSC asset of some kind that had survived the northern continent's collapse and was extracting through Covenant-held territory. Ostrander told him to look at the engagement timestamps again. Ferris looked at them. He said, after a pause that was longer than his usual processing time, that the timestamps were not consistent with any UNSC asset he was aware of, including Spartan-class personnel, and that he was not sure what they were consistent with. Prussian, who had been running continuous modeling against every UNSC combat record in her accessible database for the past 22 minutes, said that she had found no match, and that she wanted to be transparent about the fact that she had expanded her modeling parameters 3 times in the course of the analysis, and had each time encountered the same result, which was that the data did not fit any framework she had available. What Prussian did not tell Ostrander, because she was still processing the implications and had not yet arrived at a framing she was confident in, was that the element of the data that she found most difficult to account for was not the pace of the contact losses or the engagement duration, or even the apparent survival of an unarmored human in a Covenant combat zone without any detectable energy shield signature. The element she found most difficult was the directionality. The signature was not moving toward the evacuation corridors, or toward any UNSC position she could identify on the planet's surface. It was moving, with the steady and unhurried consistency of something that had a destination in mind, toward the largest Covenant ground installation on the northern continent, a forward operating base that Covenant Field Command had established in the first hours of the landing push, and that UNSC Tactical Analysis had classified as the strategic hub of the entire Sigma Octanus ground campaign. It was the most heavily defended position on the planet. It was the last place any rational UNSC asset would be moving toward, and whatever was moving toward, it was doing so at a pace that suggested it would arrive within the next 40 minutes. Saitama had identified the installation not through tactical analysis or intelligence data, but through the simple and practical observation that it was the largest concentration of structures visible in the direction he was walking, which suggested it was probably some kind of settlement or base, and that a settlement or base of that size probably had people in it who could answer his questions about where he was and how he might get back to wherever he had come from. He was aware that the structures appeared to be of a different architectural style than he was used to, which was an observation he filed away with mild interest, without drawing any particular conclusions from it. He was also aware that the area between his current position and the installation was occupied by a significant number of the same type of armed figures he had encountered in the clearing, and that they appeared to be aware of his approach, because several of them were moving toward him in organized groups that had the deliberate, coordinated quality of people who have been told something is coming and have prepared accordingly. He did not find this particularly concerning. He had been walking for about 20 minutes and had encountered 7 such groups, and the encounters had all resolved in approximately the same way, which was quickly and without lasting difficulty on his end, though he had noted with some sympathy that the groups appeared to find the encounters considerably more significant than he did. The Covenant Field Commander coordinating the Northern Continent's operations was a Sanghili named Forerunner, Manticree, who had distinguished himself in 3 previous campaigns, and who had the tactical intelligence and professional composure of an experienced officer, who had encountered most of what a war of this scale produced, and had developed measured responses for the majority of it. He received the contact reports from the sweep units in the field with the careful, methodical attention he gave to all incoming intelligence, and he processed the first several reports with the standard analytical framework he applied to unexpected contact data. By the 7th report, he had set that framework aside, because the framework was producing conclusions that did not cohere with each other or with anything in his operational experience, and he was spending more cognitive resources managing the framework's failure than extracting useful information from the data. He pulled up a direct visual feed from a Covenant reconnaissance drone that he repositioned over the contact area and watched for approximately 90 seconds, and what he saw caused him to transmit a priority communication to the Covenant's fleet command above the planet that contained, in Sanghili military communication conventions, the clearest possible indication that what was happening on the ground was outside the parameters of normal tactical response and required escalation to a level of decision-making authority that he did not himself possess. Above the planet, in the Covenant cruiser Absolute Testimony, the ship's supreme commander received Voro's transmission and read it twice, and then requested the drone footage. He watched it once and said nothing for a long time. Then he began issuing orders that would, within the hour, redirect a significant portion of the Covenant's Sigma Octanus ground assets toward a single contact point, in a concentration of force that the UNSC's orbital observers would identify as strategically anomalous before they understood what it was being directed at. The Covenant's ground concentration on the northern continent reorganized itself over the course of 40 minutes, in a way that Prussian flagged to Ostrander as tactically unprecedented in the midpoint, resolves operational record for this engagement, and in her broader database of Covenant tactical behavior across 7 documented planetary campaigns. The Covenant did not typically mass ground forces in response to a single contact point. Their tactical doctrine was distributed and layered, designed to maintain pressure across multiple vectors simultaneously, and deny UNSC forces the opportunity to identify and exploit a single point of commitment. What Prussian was observing was the opposite of that, a systematic withdrawal of Covenant units from their dispersed positions across the northern continent, and a redeployment toward a convergence point that her mapping placed directly in the path of the anomalous biological signature she had been tracking since the beginning. The convergence was drawing forces from positions that the Covenant had held since the first hours of the landing push, positions that their tactical behavior had indicated they considered strategically essential. They were abandoning those positions to concentrate on one thing, and the one thing was still walking north at the same unhurried pace it had maintained since Prussian first detected it, apparently unaware or unconcerned that it was about to walk into the largest single concentration of Covenant ground forces assembled on the planet since the initial landing. Ostrander made the decision to attempt contact. It was not a simple decision, because contacting an unknown entity operating in enemy-held territory, without understanding what the entity was introduced risks she could not fully model, and because the communication would require her to broadcast on a frequency that the Covenant could potentially intercept and use to refine their own understanding of the situation. She made it anyway, because the alternative was to continue observing while an unknown asset walked into an overwhelming Covenant concentration without any awareness that it was coming. And whatever this thing was, it had already neutralized more Covenant units in 40 minutes than the 3 Marine battalions that had been fighting for 14 hours, and losing it to an ambush it hadn't been warned about was not a consequence she was prepared to accept without attempting to prevent it. She had Prussian broadcast on the standard UNSC emergency frequency, directed at the surface coordinates of the signature, and transmitted a simple identification request. UNSC vessel midpoint resolved to unidentified ground asset. Please identify and respond. Saitama heard the transmission through what appeared to be a communication device he hadn't noticed attached to the collar of his jumpsuit, which was unusual because he didn't remember putting it there, but which he decided to engage with on the grounds that a voice speaking a language he understood was considerably more useful than everything else he had encountered in the past hour. He responded by pressing what appeared to be the relevant part of the device, and saying that he was Saitama, and that he was a hero for fun, and that he was currently walking toward some buildings and was not sure whose buildings they were, but that they appeared to be quite large. The bridge of the midpoint resolve received this transmission in complete silence, and Prussian, who had been processing the voice analysis in parallel with the communication, reported to Ostrander that the vocal pattern was consistent with a baseline human adult male, that there were no detectable stress indicators, and that the communication style was not consistent with any UNSC military personnel format she had on record, which was an observation she delivered with the specific flatness of an AI that has stopped expecting its observations to make the situation clearer. Ostrander told Prussian to keep the channel open and spoke directly to Saitama, telling him that he was approaching a heavily fortified Covenant installation, and that the Covenant were massing a significant force concentration in his path, and that she was strongly recommending he alter his direction and move toward the extraction corridors that she could provide coordinates for. Saitama listened to this information with the patient attention he gave to most warnings, which was genuine and appreciative and not particularly directive of his subsequent behavior. He said that he understood and that he appreciated the information, and that the extraction corridors sounded useful, and that he would probably head toward them once he had reached the buildings ahead, because he still had questions he was hoping someone there could answer, and the buildings were closer than the corridors. Ostrander spent a moment processing the response and then asked, with the careful precision of someone trying to establish facts that she was not confident she was correctly understanding, whether he was intending to walk into the Covenant installation. Saitama said that he was going to walk toward it and see what happened, which was his general approach to most situations he didn't fully understand, and that he had found it usually worked out. Forerunner, Manticree had assembled what his tactical assessment described as a sufficient concentration of force to address any contact the surface of Sigma Octanus IV was capable of producing: 2 full lances of his best infantry, 3 Wraith mortar tanks positioned to provide suppressing fire, and a pair of hunters deployed at the forward edge of the concentration, because hunters were the single most physically formidable ground asset in the Covenant's infantry arsenal, and their presence in a contact engagement had a consistent and predictable effect on any opponent. He had positioned this force in a broad encirclement of the contact's projected path, designed to ensure that whatever was coming had no viable direction of movement that did not bring it into engagement with Covenant forces. He had briefed his unit commanders with the honest acknowledgement that the contact's behavior to this point was anomalous, and that they should not rely on prior combat experience to predict its responses, which was the most cautious framing he had applied to an engagement briefing in his career, and which reflected the quality of the drone footage he had watched and the nature of the contact reports he had received. He was a careful and experienced officer, and he had done everything that a careful and experienced officer could do, and he watched through the drone feed as the contact, visible now as a small, bald figure in a yellow garment, moving at a walking pace through the burned forest, hands in pockets, entered the outer edge of his encirclement without apparent awareness of or concern about the several hundred Covenant warriors positioned in a perimeter around it. His senior lance commander asked whether to initiate engagement. Vale watched the figure for another moment. Then he said yes, and the encirclement activated, and the northern continent of Sigma Octanus IV produced a volume of weapons fire directed at a single point that Prussian's orbital sensors registered as the highest energy output from a ground engagement she had recorded in the campaign, and she tracked it for 4 seconds and then tracked what came after it, and updated her anomaly report with findings that she flagged at a priority level for which her communication protocols did not have a designated category, because the category had not previously been required. The weapon's fire lasted 11 seconds, which was long enough to generate a thermal signature that Prussian sensors registered as comparable to a localized orbital bombardment, and which transformed a 200-meter section of the northern continent's burned forest into something that more closely resembled the surface of a world that had been glassed, scorched earth, fused soil, the skeletal remains of trees reduced to carbon. A crater landscape that the Covenant's combined arms engagement had produced in just over a decade of seconds, with the specific, overwhelming thoroughness of a military force that had decided to resolve a problem permanently. The Wraith mortars had fired continuously. The infantry lances had maintained full plasma discharge. The hunters had deployed their assault cannons in overlapping fields of fire that covered every exit vector from the engagement zone. Vale had watched it from the drone feed with the professional attention of a commander who is monitoring an engagement to confirm its resolution rather than to manage its progress, because the level of force he had deployed against a single unarmored contact was not a level that left meaningful uncertainty about the outcome. The figure was still standing when the fire stopped. Vale looked at the drone feed for a long moment without speaking, and the silence on his command channel had the specific, charged quality of a shared experience that everyone present is processing, but no one is yet willing to be the first to articulate. The figure was standing in the center of the engagement zone, in the middle of the crater landscape that 11 seconds of concentrated Covenant firepower had produced, with its hands in its pockets, and an expression that the drone's optical resolution was sufficient to render clearly, and the expression was not the expression of a being that had survived something difficult. It was the expression of a being that was mildly assessing the state of the area around it, the way a person looks around after stepping into a space that has been recently rearranged, and is taking a moment to register what has changed. There was no visible damage. There was no visible distress. There was no indication, in the figure's posture or movement or demeanor, that the 11 seconds of fire had registered as anything other than an ambient environmental condition, like weather. Saitama looked around at the transformed landscape with the evaluating attention he gave to most environmental changes, and decided that the buildings he had been walking toward were responsible for whatever had just happened, on the grounds that they were the only potential source of that much firepower in his immediate vicinity, which meant they were probably some kind of military installation rather than a settlement, which was useful information. He also decided, looking at the area around him, that the military installation had clearly decided he was a problem of some kind, and that walking directly toward it after it had just done this to the ground around him might produce more of the same, which was not dangerous but was starting to feel repetitive. He looked for people he could talk to directly, which had been his preferred approach since arriving on this planet, and identified several hundred armed figures in a perimeter around him, who were currently very still in the specific, collective way that groups go still when something they expected to resolve has not resolved, and they are recalibrating what to do next. He walked toward the nearest cluster, which happened to be a hunter pair that had been positioned at the forward edge of Varro's encirclement, and looked at them with the open, curious attention he gave to any unfamiliar entity, because the hunters were the largest things in the encirclement, and their design was genuinely interesting from a biological standpoint. Large, heavily armored, moving with the ponderous and deliberate power of something that had never needed to develop speed, because it had never encountered anything that required it. The hunter on the left struck first, which was not a tactical decision so much as an instinct, a response produced by the specific, accumulated experience of a being whose entire combat history had consisted of being the most physically imposing thing in any engagement, and whose body had developed reflexes calibrated to that reality. The strike was a full-force overhead assault cannon blow delivered at close range, the kind of impact that had previously been used to destroy UNSC vehicles, and it connected with Saitama's shoulder and produced no result that was distinguishable from not connecting, and the hunter's assault cannon showed a visible deformation at the point of contact that suggested the impact had been harder on the weapon than on the target. Saitama looked at the hunter's arm, which was still extended from the follow-through of the blow, and then at the hunter itself, and said that it was quite strong, which was a genuine observation rather than a compliment, and that it reminded him of some of the stronger monsters he had encountered in his own experience, though not the strongest. He said this with the honest, slightly detached quality of someone making a fair comparative assessment. And then, because the hunter was preparing a second strike, and he had found that the second strike in these situations was never more productive than the first, he tapped it once on the center of its shield with an open palm, and the hunter traveled backward through the air and came to rest against a section of the forest perimeter 50 meters away. And the Bond brother activated immediately in the specific, mandatory aggression response that hunter pairs were biologically compelled to engage, and came at Saitama from the right, and received the same result, and came to rest 8 meters from the first. Varro issued the order to fall back to the installation's defensive perimeter, which was the only remaining rational tactical option, and watched his assembled forces begin a withdrawal that had the shape of a retreat, even though he had been careful not to use that word in the order. He transmitted a second priority communication to Fleet Command that was longer than the first and that contained, in its final paragraph, a direct and unambiguous request for guidance that Sanghaley military convention generally reserved for situations of genuine strategic uncertainty. He said that the contact was human in appearance, unarmored, invulnerable to combined arms engagement including hunter assault, and was currently walking toward the installation's main entrance at a walking pace. He said he did not have a tactical response to propose because his tactical framework did not contain one, and that he was requesting that Fleet Command provide direction that his framework could not. Above the planet, in the absolute testimony, the Supreme Commander read Varro's second communication, and then walked to the ship's observation deck and looked at the planet below for a long time, and the specific quality of his stillness was one that his senior staff, who knew him well, recognized as the stillness of a being confronting a category of problem that his considerable experience had not prepared him for. The Supreme Commander's name was Theological, and he was not the Thel who would later become the Arbiter, but he carried the same family name and something of the same quality of mind. The capacity for honest assessment in situations where honest assessment was uncomfortable, which was rarer in Covenant command structures than the Covenant's self-image suggested, and which was, in Theological's case, the product of 3 decades of campaign experience that had taught him the specific and important lesson that the most dangerous moment in any engagement was not the moment of greatest apparent threat, But the moment when a commander's framework stopped matching the reality it was supposed to describe. His framework had stopped matching the reality of Sigma Octanus IV's northern continent approximately 20 minutes ago, and he had been standing at the observation deck long enough to have worked through the first and second instinctive responses, increased force, theological interpretation, and arrived at the third, which was the response that his experience told him was the correct one, and that his institutional position made the most difficult to act on, which was honest and complete uncertainty about what to do next. He returned to his command station and reviewed everything that had been transmitted from Voro's position in sequence, including the drone footage, the contact reports, and the engagement records from the encirclement. He then did something that supreme commanders of his rank very rarely did in active campaign situations, which was convene an advisory consultation with his 3 senior field commanders simultaneously, pulling them from their respective positions across the ship via secure channel, and presenting them with the full data package without editorial framing and asking them, directly and without the hierarchical pressure that typically shaped responses in Covenant command consultations, what they believed was happening and what they believed should be done about it. The responses he received were consistent in their inconsistency. 3 experienced commanders producing 3 different frameworks for what they were looking at, none of which agreed with each other, and all of which agreed on exactly one point, which was that the existing tactical response options had been exhausted, and that whatever came next needed to be qualitatively different from what had already been tried. The decision Theological made was one that would be debated extensively in Covenant military analysis for years afterward, in the institutional channels through which the Covenant processed its operational history and extracted lessons from it. He ordered a full withdrawal of Covenant ground forces from Sigma Octanus IV's northern continent to the installation's interior, converting the forward operating base from an offensive hub to a defensive stronghold, and simultaneously transmitted a request to the hierarchs, the Covenant's supreme religious and political authority, for theological guidance on the nature of the contact, framing it in the specific language that the Covenant's military-religious interface used for situations that exceeded conventional tactical parameters. He used the word recusant, which in Covenant theological convention referred to an entity or phenomenon that resisted categorization within the existing framework of the Great Journey, and which triggered a specific and significant escalation process within the Covenant's hierarchical structure that Thel knew would bring attention to Sigma Octanus IV from levels of the Covenant's authority that did not normally engage with ground campaign developments. He knew this was a significant step. He took it because the alternative was to continue applying tactical responses to a situation that had already demonstrated it was not a tactical situation, and he was too experienced to make that mistake twice. On the midpoint resolve, Prussian tracked the Covenant ground withdrawal with the careful attention of someone watching a development they had not predicted and were not sure how to interpret. The withdrawal was real, and it was comprehensive. Covenant units pulling back from dispersed positions across the northern continent and consolidating inside the installation's perimeter in a pattern that her tactical modeling indicated was defensive rather than repositioning. She brought this to Ostrander with the observation that the Covenant appeared to have shifted from offensive operations to defensive posture in direct response to the single anomalous contact, which was a strategic response she had no precedent for in her database of Covenant tactical behavior, because the Covenant did not go defensive in response to individual contacts. And the fact that they had done so here represented a shift in their operational logic that she could not fully account for with any framework she possessed. Ostrander had maintained the open channel to Saitama throughout the engagement, listening to the periodic updates he offered with the patient and slightly stunned quality of someone who has received information they believe to be accurate and cannot fully integrate. He had described the encirclement, noted that there had been a lot of firing from various directions, observed that the ground was now in a different condition than it had been, and mentioned that the large armored creatures had been interesting but not especially difficult to deal with. He had said all of this in the conversational, factual tone of someone narrating a mildly eventful walk, and Ostrander had listened to it and passed the relevant portions to Prussian, and received in return analysis that confirmed what the tone of the narration had already suggested, which was that the engagement had been as uncomplicated as Saitama made it sound. She spoke to him now and told him that the Covenant appeared to be withdrawing to their installation, and that she was recommending he take the opportunity to move toward the extraction corridor coordinates she had transmitted earlier. Saitama said he appreciated the recommendation, and that he was still planning to look at the buildings first, and that the large ones at the center of the installation were quite impressive from an architectural standpoint, and that he was curious about what was inside them, and that he would head to the extraction point afterward. Ostrander closed her eyes briefly, and then told Prussian to update the extraction timeline to account for an extended delay. What neither Ostrander nor Saitama knew, in the moment of that conversation, was that the extraction point they were planning toward was about to become significantly less relevant, because Prussian's long-range sensors had just registered a new contact in the system's outer boundary, a UNSC vessel, heavily encrypted in its transponder signal, approaching Sigma Octanus IV on a course that Prussian's navigation modeling identified as deliberately unannounced, and that her database cross-referenced against a specific and narrow category of UNSC operational profile that she flagged to Ostrander with a note that said the approaching vessel appeared to be associated with the UNSC's Office of Naval Intelligence, and that ONI's presence at an engagement site that contained an anomalous biological contact of this nature was almost certainly not a coincidence. The Office of Naval Intelligence vessel that entered the Sigma Octanus system was designated the Pale Inquiry, and it had been moving toward the system for 11 hours, which meant it had been redirected before the engagement data from the northern continent had been transmitted to UNSC Fleet Command through normal channels, which meant ONI had known about the anomalous contact before Ostrander had filed her first priority report, which meant they had a source of information about Sigma Octanus IV that was operating independently of the midpoint Resolve's communication chain. Ostrander sat with this conclusion for approximately 30 seconds before accepting it, because it was the kind of conclusion that had implications she found uncomfortable. Not because ONI's independent intelligence sources were surprising. They were a well-understood feature of the organization's operational culture, but because the speed of the Pale Inquiry's response suggested that whatever ONI knew about the anomalous contact, they had assessed it as significant enough to redirect a dedicated vessel before they had even a fraction of the data that Prussian had spent the past several hours accumulating. They had seen something in whatever their source had provided and had moved immediately, and the immediacy of that movement told Ostrander that what they had seen had not required extended analysis to produce a response decision. The Pale Inquiry's commanding officer made contact with the midpoint Resolve 40 minutes after entering the system, which was the amount of time required to close to secure communication range, and the contact was not a courtesy call. The officer identified herself as Captain Soren Vale and told Ostrander, with the flat, informational directness that ONI officers used as a substitute for warmth in professional interactions, that the Pale Inquiry was assuming operational authority over the Sigma Octanus IV contact situation effective immediately, that Ostrander should consider all of her current operational parameters subordinate to Vale's direction from this point forward, and that she was requesting a full transfer of Prussian's accumulated contact data within the next 10 minutes. Ostrander processed the authority transfer with the professionalism of a career officer who understands when she is not in a position to contest a command decision, transmitted Prussian's data as requested, and then asked Vale, with the careful precision of someone who knows they are only going to get one question, what ONI had known about this contact before the midpoint resolves reports. Vale looked at her through the communication display for a moment, and then said that she was not in a position to answer that question, but that Ostrander's instinct in asking it was correct, and closed the channel. The Pale inquiry carried, in addition to its standard crew, a team of ONI's senior analytical personnel, and a 4-person Spartan fire team designated Indigo, which had been assigned to the vessel before departure, and which represented, in the specific calculus of ONI operational deployment, a level of resource commitment that indicated the organization considered the situation on Sigma Octanus IV to be in a category that required Spartan-class response capability. The Spartan team leader was a woman designated Indigo 1, who had been briefed on the available contact data during the 11-hour transit, and who had spent most of that time doing what Spartans did with intelligence briefings, which was reading them very carefully and very thoroughly, and then reading them again, and who had arrived at the same conclusion that every other analytical framework applied to the data had arrived at, which was that the conclusion the data pointed toward was not a conclusion her existing framework could accommodate, and that she was going to need direct observation before she could produce anything useful. She had said this to Vale in their pre-arrival briefing, with the characteristic Spartan economy of language that conveyed exactly what needed to be conveyed and nothing additional, and Vale had said that direct observation was precisely what she was going to get. Saitama had reached the Covenant installation's outer perimeter by the time the Pale inquiry achieved orbital insertion, and he had found it considerably quieter than the approach had been, because Voro's withdrawal order had been efficiently executed, and the installation's external positions were now unmanned, the Covenant forces having consolidated inside the structure's inner defensive layers in the configuration that Prussian had identified as defensive posture. Saitama walked through the unmanned outer perimeter with the unhurried attention of someone exploring an unfamiliar building, looking at the Covenant architecture with genuine interest. The organic curves of their construction methodology, the bioluminescent materials that produce the specific, cold light of Covenant interior spaces, the scale of the installation's main structures, which were larger up close than they had appeared from a distance, and which had the quality of spaces designed for beings who thought about their environment differently than he was used to. He found the main entrance, which was sealed, and pushed it open with the minimal effort that sealed doors required when the mechanism holding them closed was designed to resist forces that were significantly smaller than the one being applied, and walked inside. Forerunner, Manticree was in the installation's command center when his perimeter sensors reported the outer seal breach, and he looked at the display and understood immediately what it meant, and transmitted a final communication to Fleet Command that was brief and specific, and that Theological, receiving it in the absolute testimony, read with the expression of someone who had been expecting a message of this kind, and who had hoped it would not arrive as quickly as it had. Voro's communication said that the contact had entered the installation, and that he was requesting permission to evacuate non-combat personnel through the installation's secondary exits, because he no longer believed the installation's defensive posture was going to serve its intended purpose, and that he wanted to preserve what he could before the situation resolved itself, in the way it was clearly going to resolve itself. Theological granted the request without hesitation, because he had arrived, in the hours since Voro's first communication, at the same honest assessment of the situation's trajectory, and because the lives of non-combat personnel were not something he was willing to sacrifice to maintain an institutional position that the evidence had already undermined. In the Pale Inquiry's briefing room, Indigo 1 reviewed the perimeter breach data that Prussian had forwarded in real time and told her team that they were going in, and that their objective was observation and communication, not engagement, and that she was saying this last part explicitly and not as a general guideline but as a direct order, because she had read the data carefully enough to understand that engagement was not a category of response that was going to be useful here. And she wanted that understood before they were in the same physical space as the thing they were going to observe. Indigo team inserted via Pelican dropship to the installation's secondary landing pad, which Voro's evacuation order had cleared of Covenant personnel in the 20 minutes between the perimeter breach and their arrival, and which gave them an entry point into the structure that did not require them to pass through the areas where Saitama had most recently been, though Prussian's tracking of his movement through the installation's internal sensor network, which she had accessed through a combination of ONI decryption tools, and the significant advantage of the Covenant's internal systems being momentarily more occupied with the evacuation than with counter-intrusion, meant that Indigo One had a reasonably current picture of his location as they moved through the installation's corridors. He was in the central hub, which was the installation's largest interior space, and he appeared to be stationary, which Prussian had noted was unusual relative to his consistent movement pattern since she had first detected him, and which suggested he had found something in the central hub that was holding his attention. What was holding his attention, as Indigo team discovered when they reached the hub's outer corridor and Indigo One looked through the observation panel set into the sealed door, was a Covenant weapons display. A ceremonial arrangement of Covenant armaments mounted on the hub's central wall in the configuration that senior Covenant installation used to mark significant campaign achievements, and which Saitama was currently examining with the focused, interested attention of someone in a museum who has found an exhibit they find genuinely engaging. Indigo One studied him through the observation panel for approximately 90 seconds, before signaling her team to hold position and opening the communication channel to Ostrander that she had been routed through Prussian's relay. She described what she was seeing in the precise, economical language of a Spartan field report, subject stationary, examining Covenant ceremonial display, no apparent awareness of Indigo team's presence, behavioral profile consistent with casual exploration rather than tactical activity, and asked Prussian for any additional data on the subject's physical indicators that the installation's internal sensors could provide. Prussian told her that the installation's biosensors were registering the subject's vital signs as baseline human normal across all measurable parameters, that his heart rate was the resting heart rate of someone engaged in calm, low exertion activity, and that his cortisol indicators showed no elevation consistent with recent extreme physical activity, which she noted was physiologically inconsistent with the engagement data from the northern continent by a significant margin. Indigo One said that she understood, and that the inconsistency was consistent with everything else in the data package, and asked Prussian to confirm that the subject's behavioral profile did not indicate immediate threat. Prussian confirmed this. Indigo One told her team to stand down from combat readiness and opened the hub's door and walked in. Saitama heard the door and turned around and looked at the 4 figures who had entered the hub with the open, assessing expression he used for most new arrivals, and found them immediately more interesting than most of the armed figures he had encountered on the planet, for the specific reason that they were visibly human in their proportions despite the armor, which was the first indication he had received since arriving on this world that there were other humans present somewhere. He said, with the direct and unguarded relief of someone who has been hopping for exactly this, that he was very glad to see people he could probably talk to, and that he had a number of questions that he had been trying to find answers to since he arrived. Indigo One stopped walking approximately 5 meters from him and looked at him through her visor for a moment, and then said, with the careful precision of someone who has prepared for multiple possible versions of a first contact, and who is rapidly identifying which version she is in, that she had questions as well, and that she was happy to try to answer his if he was willing to do the same. Saitama said that sounded like a reasonable arrangement and asked who she was, and what the planet was called, and what the large alien figures were, and why they were fighting, because he had gathered that a fight was happening, but had not been able to establish the basic facts of it. Indigo gave him an abbreviated briefing on the Human Covenant War, which she delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who has explained this particular reality many times to many different people, and who knows which elements are most important for establishing basic comprehension. She told him about humanity's first contact with the Covenant, about the pattern of the war's development, about the current strategic situation, and what Sigma Octanus IV represented within it. She watched his expression as she spoke, because reading people's responses to information was a skill she had developed extensively, and what she read in his expression was genuine and attentive interest without any of the emotional charge that this information typically produced in people hearing it for the first time. No fear, no anger, no particular strategic calculation. He was listening the way someone listens to an explanation of a situation they find interesting, but that they have not yet decided has direct implications for them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said that it was a large war, and that the other side appeared to have significantly more resources than the human side based on what he had seen, and that this seemed like a difficult situation. Indigo said that it was. Saitama nodded slowly, in the processing way rather than the acknowledgement way, and then asked whether there was anything specific that needed to be done right now that he could help with, because he was generally available, and the installation appeared to still have Covenant personnel in its lower levels who he had not yet encountered, and he was happy to address that if it was useful, or to leave them alone if that was preferred. Indigo looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Indigo 2, who was the team's tactical specialist, and Indigo 2 made a very small gesture that, in Spartan non-verbal communication, meant that he had no framework for advising on this particular question. Indigo looked back at Saitama and said, with the honest pragmatism that was her most defining professional characteristic, that she was going to need to transmit this conversation to her commanding officer before she could authorize anything, and that she was asking him to stay in the hub and wait while she did that. Saitama said that was fine and turned back to the weapons display, because he hadn't finished looking at it. Indigo stepped back into the corridor and opened a channel to Vale, and said that she needed the captain on a secure line immediately, and that what she was about to describe was going to require a command decision that she was not in a position to make herself. Captain Soren Vale had spent 17 years in the Office of Naval Intelligence, which was long enough to have developed the specific professional characteristic that distinguished experienced ONI officers from experienced officers in every other branch of the UNSC, which was the capacity to hold two contradictory pieces of information simultaneously, without immediately resolving the contradiction in favor of whichever piece was more comfortable. The contradiction she was currently holding was this: the most significant strategic asset she had encountered in 17 years of intelligence work was sitting in a Covenant installation on Sigma Octanus IV looking at a weapons display, and the asset had no loyalty to the UNSC, no understanding of the war's strategic dimensions, no military training, no chain of command, and no apparent interest in acquiring any of those things. And the only leverage she had with respect to it was the leverage of a genuine conversation with someone who had decided, on no particular basis beyond availability, that he was willing to be helpful. She had been in situations with less to work with, technically speaking. She had never been in a situation where the gap between what was available and what was needed was quite this specific in its shape. Not a shortage of resources, but a complete inapplicability of every tool she had for converting a resource into a reliable asset. She listened to Indigo-1's transmission in full without interrupting, and when it was finished, she sat for a moment and then asked Indigo-1 3 questions. The first was whether Saitama had expressed any preference about his situation, whether he wanted to leave the planet, whether he had a destination, whether there was anything he had indicated wanting that Vale could potentially provide. Indigo once said that he wanted to find his way back to wherever he had come from, that he did not know how to do that, and that in the meantime he appeared to have no particular preferences beyond finding things that were interesting and occasionally eating, and that he had mentioned food twice in the conversation in a way that suggested it was not an incidental concern. The second question was whether Indigo One believed he was telling the truth about his willingness to help. Indigo One said that she did, and that she was basing this on the assessment that his behavioral profile was not consistent with any form of strategic deception she had encountered, and that the most accurate way she could describe it was that he appeared to be exactly what he said he was, which was genuinely unusual in her experience, and which she was flagging as a data point rather than a conclusion. The third question was whether Indigo One had formed any assessment of his motivation structure, what he responded to, what engaged him, what he found meaningful. Indigo One was quiet for a moment, and then said that the most accurate answer she could give was that he appeared to be looking for something that required his full effort, and that he had not found it yet in anything the planet had offered him so far, and that this seemed to be the most significant feature of his psychology. Vale sat with the third answer for longer than the first two, because it was the one that had operational implications, and the implications were not comfortable. What Indigo One had described was a motivational structure that the war could potentially speak to, if framed correctly. The war was the largest conflict in human history, and it contained, within its scale and its violence and its desperate, grinding attrition, challenges that exceeded the capacity of every human system that had been brought to bear on it, which meant it contained, in principle, the kind of challenge that a being with Saitama's capacity and Saitama's particular hunger might find genuinely engaging. The discomfort was in the ethics of the framing, which she was not going to resolve in the next 20 minutes, and which she set aside because the operational situation did not have 20 minutes available for ethical resolution. She told Indigo One to stay with the subject and maintain the conversation and to be honest with him, and that she was coming down personally, which was a decision she had not made lightly because ONI captains did not typically insert themselves into active ground situations, but which felt necessary because the conversation that needed to happen next was not one she was willing to delegate. Satama was still looking at the weapons display when Vale arrived 40 minutes later, having inserted with a two-person security detail that she had told to stay at the hub's entrance, and to treat the subject with the same courtesy they would extend to a senior flag officer, which had produced expressions she chose not to engage with. She walked to where he was standing and introduced herself by name and rank, and told him directly that she was the senior UNSC officer currently in the Sigma Octanus system, and that she had come personally, because she believed the conversation they needed to have was important enough to warrant it. Saitama looked at her, and said he appreciated that, and asked whether she had eaten, because he was starting to notice the absence of food and was wondering whether the installation had anything available. Vale told her security detail to locate rations from the Pelican supply kit and bring them to the hub, and then turned back to Saitama and said that she wanted to be honest with him about something before they talked about anything else, and that the honesty was going to require him to understand that what she was about to say was not a manipulation, but a genuine representation of a difficult situation. She told him about the war in the terms that ONI used internally rather than the terms that public communications used, which were considerably bleaker and considerably more accurate. She told him about the pace of the Covenant's advance, about the worlds that had already been lost, about the strategic trajectory that UNSC's best analysts projected if current conditions held. She told him, without editorial framing, that humanity was losing, and that the rate of loss was not a situation that human military capacity alone was projected to reverse, and that she was saying this to him not to ask him to fix it. She was careful about this, because asking felt like the wrong instrument, but because she believed he deserved to understand the full reality of the situation he had arrived in the middle of. Saitama listened to all of it with the serious, attentive expression he used for information that he was genuinely processing, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said that it was a very large problem, and that he understood why she was telling him, and that he appreciated the honesty. He said he was going to think about it. Vale said she understood and meant it, and the security detail arrived with rations, and Saitama ate them with the focused, appreciative attention he brought to food, and the hub was quiet around them. And outside the installation, the northern continent of Sigma Octanus IV was very still in the way that places are still after a significant amount of force has moved through them and left. The hierarch's response to Theological theological escalation request arrived in the absolute testimony 14 hours after it was transmitted, which was faster than the standard response time for hierarch consultations by a significant margin, and which indicated that whatever review process the Covenant's supreme religious authority had applied to his request, it had not been a lengthy one. The response came in two parts. The first was a theological classification, delivered in the formal register of Covenant Religious Declaration, that designated the contact on Sigma Octanus IV as a recusant of the First Order, which was a classification that Theological had never seen applied in his 3 decades of service, and that his theological advisor, a minister of devotion named Uru Kasomi, told him had not been formally applied in over 400 years of Covenant history, and that in those historical instances had designated entities or phenomena that the Covenant's religious framework had determined were operating outside the natural order of the Great Journey in ways that required extraordinary response rather than standard military engagement. The second part of the hierarch's response was an authority transfer. The Sigma Octanus operation was being removed from Fleet Command's jurisdiction and reassigned to a Covenant force that Thel had heard of but never encountered directly, a special operations division that operated under direct hierarch authority, and that was known in Covenant military circles by a title that translated approximately as the Devoted Edge, whose existence was not widely acknowledged and whose operational history was not included in standard military records. The commander of the Devoted Edge force assigned to Sigma Octanus was a Sanghili named Sessa Refumi, who arrived in the system 18 hours after the hierarch's response with 3 stealth corvettes and a ground complement of the Covenant's most capable Special Operations infantry. Special Operations Sanghili, who had been selected for the Devoted Edge precisely because their operational experience included situations that exceeded standard military parameters, and who had been briefed on the contact data with the specific framing of the recusant classification, which in Covenant theological terms meant they were not going into a military engagement, but into something that their faith defined as a confrontation with an anomaly in the order of things, which produced in them a quality of focused, serious engagement that was distinct from ordinary combat motivation, and that Sessa had cultivated carefully because he understood that the distinction mattered for what they were about to do. He did not believe the contact could be defeated by conventional means. The data was too clear for that belief to survive honest examination. What he believed was that the Covenant's response needed to be extraordinary in its nature, not merely in its scale, and that the Devoted Edge existed precisely for situations where that distinction was the operative one. His plan did not involve direct engagement as its primary mechanism. He had studied Varro's encirclement data and the contact's response to it, and he had noted the same thing that everyone else who examined the data noted, which was that the contact's physical response to kinetic and energy engagement was effectively null, and that repeating the engagement with more force was not a strategy that the evidence supported. What Sessa proposed instead was an approach built on the Covenant's understanding of the Forerunner, because the Forerunner's technology represented the outer boundary of what the known universe had produced in terms of physical capability, and because the Sigma Octanus system contained, on the planet's southern continent, a Forerunner installation that the Covenant had identified and secured in the first hours of the landing push, and that had not been the focus of anyone's attention since. Because the ground campaign's development had redirected all available resources northward. The installation was a Forerunner research complex, partially intact, and it contained technology that Covenant archaeological teams had classified as belonging to a period of Forerunner development that predated the Flood conflict. Technology designed, as best the Covenant's researchers could determine, not for combat but for measurement and analysis of fundamental physical properties, including properties of biological systems that exceeded normal parameters. Sessa's plan was to use that technology to analyze the contact, not to defeat him, but to understand him in the terms that Forerunner science might provide where Covenant science had failed, and to use that understanding to determine whether there was a response available to the Covenant that the current framework had not yet produced. It was a more sophisticated plan than anything Voro had been able to construct, and it reflected a quality of strategic thinking that the devoted Edge had been built around, and it had exactly one significant operational problem, which was that executing it required getting Saitama to the Forerunner installation on the southern continent, which required either cooperation or transportation. And transportation implied a level of physical control over the subject that the available data suggested was not achievable. Saitama, who had been sleeping in the Covenant installation's command center on a makeshift arrangement of Covenant furnishings that Indigo had helped him construct with the practical efficiency of a soldier who has learned that rest is a resource and should be obtained when available, woke up when Prussian's relay transmitted a priority alert through the communication device that was still on his collar, and listened to Vale's briefing on the new Covenant forces' arrival with the attentive, serious expression he used for information that had operational implications he was still working out. Vale told him that the new force was different from the ground forces he had encountered, that it was a specialized unit operating under different authority, and that her analysts believed its presence meant the Covenant's response to his existence was escalating beyond the tactical level to something that involved their highest leadership. Saitama listened and then asked, with the honest directness that was his consistent register, whether this meant the situation was getting more serious. Vale said it did. He nodded slowly and said that he had been thinking, since their conversation the previous evening, about what she had told him about the war, and that he had arrived at a position he wanted to share with her, and that he wanted to be honest about it the way she had been honest with him. He said that he was not going to pretend to have a plan or a strategy, because he didn't understand the war well enough for plans or strategies to be things he could usefully contribute. He said that what he could offer was presence and availability, which in his experience were the things that mattered most in situations where the specific problems were too unpredictable to plan against in detail. He said that if the Covenant's new force was coming for him specifically, he was content to be the thing they were coming for, and that if being that thing was useful to the humans who were fighting the war, he was available for it. Vale looked at him for a moment and then said, with the plain and honest relief of someone who has been carrying more of the weight of a situation than they are equipped to carry alone, and who has just been offered genuine help, that it was useful, and that she was grateful, and that she was going to make sure he had whatever he needed while he was available. Saitama said that food would be useful, and a better sleeping arrangement if one was available, and that he would like to know more about the war if she was willing to keep explaining it, because he found that understanding the context of a situation helped him pay attention to the right things. Vale said she would explain whatever he wanted to know. And in the system's outer boundary, Sessa, Refumi's 3 stealth corvettes finished their deceleration burn and began the approach to Sigma Octanus IV, carrying a plan that was built on Forerunner technology and theological certainty and careful strategic thinking, and that was going to encounter, at its execution point, the same fundamental problem that every plan directed at Saitama encountered, which was that the plan's assumptions about what was possible did not match the reality of what they were directed at, and the mismatch was going to be consequential. Sessa Refumi's insertion to Sigma Octanus IV's surface was conducted with the specific, practiced invisibility that the devoted edge had been built to achieve, 3 corvettes holding at the upper atmospheric boundary, while Sessa's ground complement descended in drop pods designed to scatter across a wide insertion zone and minimize the radar cross-section that would be visible to the UNSC vessel in orbit. Prussian detected the insertion anyway, because Prussian was very good at her function, and because the stealth technology's effectiveness had limits that a military AI with access to the right sensor frequencies could work within, but she detected it late enough that, by the time she had confirmed the contact classification and transmitted the alert to Vale, the devoted edge's ground element was already assembled on the southern continent and moving toward the Forerunner installation that Sessa's intelligence had identified as the operational center of his plan. Vale received the alert and immediately updated her tactical picture, and then opened the channel to Indigo and told her that the new Covenant force was on the ground, on the southern continent, moving toward the Forerunner installation, and that her analysts believed the installation was the objective rather than a transit point, and that she needed Indigo assessment of what that meant for Saitama's safety. Indigo said, after a brief pause, that she did not believe it meant anything for Saitama's safety specifically, and that her concern ran in the other direction, which was what Saitama's presence at the Forerunner installation would mean for Sessa's plan and for the installation itself. Saitama had decided, when Vale briefed him on the devoted edge's insertion, that the southern continent sounded worth visiting, and had said so with the honest directness that had characterized every decision he had made since arriving on the planet. He said that if the new Covenant force was going to the Forerunner installation for reasons related to him, it seemed logical that he should also go to the Forerunner installation, on the grounds that being present at the place where things were happening was generally more useful than being present at the place where things had already happened. Vale had processed this for a moment and then agreed, not because the logic was strategically sophisticated, but because it was correct in the straightforward way that direct approaches are often correct, and because the alternative was to keep Saitama on the northern continent while the devoted edge operated freely on the southern one, which her instincts told her was a worse configuration than the one Saitama was proposing. She had Indigo team transport him south via Pelican, which was a 40-minute flight that Saitama spent looking out the viewport at the planet's surface, with the patient, interested attention of someone seeing a new landscape for the first time and finding it worth the attention. The Forerunner installation on the southern continent was a research complex of moderate size by Forerunner standards, which meant it was significantly larger than anything humanity had constructed on the planet, built from the characteristic gray-blue Forerunner alloy that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being placed on it, its surfaces carrying the dense, intricate geometric patterning that the Covenant interpreted as sacred text, and that UNSC archaeologists had been trying to decode for decades without complete success. Sessa's team had arrived 40 minutes before Indigo team's Pelican and had secured the installation's perimeter and activated the internal systems, which responded to Covenant activation protocols with the specific, cooperative behavior of technology that had been built with the Covenant's eventual arrival in mind, or rather with the arrival of beings who carried the Forerunner's genetic legacy in the form the Covenant believed gave them authority over the Forerunner's inheritance. The installation's primary analysis chamber was active and running when Sessa entered it, its systems cycling through initialization sequences that his technical specialists confirmed were consistent with the measurement and analysis functions that the Covenant's archaeological records had documented for this type of facility. CESA's plan, in its operational specifics, was to use the installation's biological analysis systems to generate a Forerunner-level assessment of Saitama's physical properties, on the theory that if Forerunner science could not measure him, the unmeasurability was itself meaningful data, and that if it could, the data would provide a framework for a response that no Covenant or human technology had been able to construct. It was a careful plan, built on genuine strategic intelligence, and it had been the product of more serious thinking than anything the Covenant had previously directed at Saitama's situation. It had, as its central operational requirement, the presence of the subject in the analysis chamber, which CESA had intended to address through a combination of the Devoted Edge's special operations capability and the theological framing of the recusant classification, which in Covenant convention carried specific ritual procedures that could be used to compel the presence of a designated entity at a site of theological significance. He had prepared the ritual procedures and had briefed his team on them, and he was in the process of reviewing the final preparation when the installation's perimeter sensors reported that a UNSC Pelican had landed outside and that the contact had walked off it and was approaching the installation's entrance. CESA stood in the analysis chamber and looked at his tactical display and processed the information that his quarry had come to him voluntarily, which was not something his plan had accounted for because it was not something his planning framework had considered as a realistic possibility. He told his team to hold their positions and not to engage, and walked to the installation's entrance himself, because the situation had shifted in a way that his instincts told him required his personal presence at the point of first contact rather than a delegated response. He reached the entrance as Saitama walked through it, and they looked at each other across approximately 4 meters of Forerunner corridor, and CESA said, in the measured, formal sanghali of a senior officer conducting an assessment, that he had not expected the contact to come to the installation. Saitama said that he had heard it was interesting and that interesting things were generally worth seeing, and asked whether CESA was the leader of the new group, because he looked like a leader. CESA said that he was. Saitama said that he had questions, and that he had found that leaders sometimes had better answers than other people, and asked whether they could talk. CESA looked at him for a long moment, at the yellow jumpsuit, the complete absence of armor, the expression that was open and unhurried, and entirely without the quality of threat that everything the data had described should have produced in a being of this capability, and said, with the careful and honest acknowledgement of a being who has arrived at a situation his framework did not fully prepare him for, that they could talk, and that he had questions as well, and that the installation's analysis chamber was available if the contact was willing to enter it. Saitama said that a chamber sounded fine and asked whether there was anywhere nearby to get food first, because the Pelican flight had been 40 minutes and he had not eaten since the rations that morning. The conversation between CESA and Saitama lasted 2 hours, which was longer than CESA had planned for and shorter than the questions it generated would have required to fully address, and it took place in the installation's secondary chamber adjacent to the analysis room, which CESA's technical specialists had identified as a Forerunner administrative space, and which contained furnishings that were not human in their design, but that were functional enough for the purpose of 2 beings sitting across from each other and speaking honestly. CESA had arranged for food from the Devoted Edge's supply stores, which Saitama ate with the appreciative, focused attention he brought to all food, and which produced in the Devoted Edge's warriors who were observing from the chamber's perimeter the specific, collective dissonance of watching, something the data had described as the most physically significant contact the Covenant had encountered in decades. Eat ration packs, with the contentment of someone whose primary concern is that the food is warm enough. Sessa asked his questions in the careful, methodical order of someone who has thought about the sequence, and who understands that the order in which information is gathered shapes the conclusions it permits. He asked about origin, capability, experience, motivation, and intention in that sequence, and Saitama answered each question with the same complete, undefended honesty that had characterized every conversation he had been part of since arriving on the planet. And the answers produced in Sessa the same progressive recalibration they had produced in Vale and Indigo and Ostrander, and every other intelligent being who had engaged with Saitama in sustained conversation. What Sessa was recalibrating toward was not a tactical conclusion. It was something closer to a philosophical one, which was unusual for him in a professional context, but which the situation seemed to require. He had come to Sigma Octanus IV operating within a framework that the hierarchs, recusant classification had provided, which defined Saitama as an anomaly in the order of things that the Covenant's theological and military structures needed to address. The conversation was producing in him a persistent and growing uncertainty about whether the framework was the right one, not because Saitama had argued against it. He had not, because he had no knowledge of it, but because the being sitting across from him was too consistently ordinary in his self-presentation to occupy the role the framework assigned him, and Sessa's experience with difficult situations had taught him that when a framework and a reality persistently failed to match, the correct response was to examine the framework rather than the reality. He had not shared this uncertainty with his team, because the operational implications of a senior, devoted edge commander questioning a hierarch-issued theological classification were significant and required careful management, but he was aware of it and was tracking it. Saitama had agreed, after the conversation, to enter the analysis chamber, which he had done with the cooperative straightforwardness of someone who has been asked to do something that costs them nothing and produces something useful for the people who asked. The chamber's systems had initialized when he entered, its sensors beginning the measurement protocols that Forerunner research facilities of this type had been designed to execute, and Sessa's technical specialists had monitored the readouts with the focused attention of people who understood that what the systems produced in the next several minutes was the entire purpose of the devoted edge's presence on this planet. The readouts had begun normally, baseline biological measurements, mass and density figures, neural activity indicators, and had then, approximately 40 seconds into the measurement sequence, begun behaving in ways that the specialists described to Sessa in increasingly uncertain language. The mass readings were stable. The density readings were stable. Every measurable physical parameter that the Forerunner systems could assess directly was within normal human ranges, with minor variances that did not approach significance. The anomalous readings were in the parameters that the Forerunner systems measured indirectly, the parameters that described not what a biological system was in its physical composition, but what it was in its relationship to the fundamental forces that physical composition interacted with. And those readings were producing outputs that the specialists were having difficulty interpreting, because the outputs were in ranges that the display systems appeared not to have been designed to render clearly, as if the values fell outside the expected scope of the measurement. Sessa reviewed the readouts himself, standing at the chamber's monitoring station, while Saitama stood in the center of the measurement field with his hands in his pockets, looking at the chamber's ceiling with the mild, interested attention of someone examining architecture. He studied the indirect parameter readings for a long time, and then he called his most senior technical specialist, a Covenant archaeologist named Luro, who had spent 20 years working with Forerunner systems, and who understood their measurement conventions better than anyone else in the devoted edge, and asked her to explain what the indirect readings were describing. Luro looked at the displays and was quiet for longer than Sessa had ever seen her be quiet when presented with a technical question, and then said, with the careful and slightly strained precision of someone constructing language for a concept their vocabulary does not fully contain, that the indirect parameters appeared to be measuring the subject's relationship to physical causality, the degree to which the normal chain of cause and effect that governed physical interactions applied to him, and that the readings were indicating that the relationship was different from any biological system the Forerunner's research had apparently encountered, not in degree but in kind, and that the display anomalies were occurring because the systems were attempting to render values that their designers had apparently not considered it necessary to include display ranges for, because the designers had not anticipated a biological subject whose readings would fall in those ranges. Sessa asked her to explain what the ranges indicated in practical terms. Luro said, after another long pause, that the most accurate way she could describe it was that the measurement was attempting to quantify how much of the physical universe's normal causality applied to the subject, and that the answer the system was producing appeared to be a very small fraction of the total, and that the fraction appeared to be getting smaller the more precisely the system attempted to measure it. As if the act of precise measurement was itself revealing that the answer was approaching something that the measurement system could not express as a finite value. Sessa looked at the readouts and then looked at Saitama, who had lowered his gaze from the ceiling and was now looking at the monitoring station with the mild, curious attention of someone who is aware that something interesting is happening and is waiting to find out what it is. Sessa said, to Luro and to himself, and to the available universe in general, that what she was describing was not a recusant in the theological sense, and that the hierarch's classification was wrong, and that what was standing in the analysis chamber was not an anomaly in the order of things, but something that the order of things did not fully reach, which was a different category of entity than the Covenant's entire theological framework had ever had to account for, and that the implications of this for the great journey and for the Covenant's understanding of the universe were significant enough that he was going to need to be very careful about how he transmitted this information upward through the hierarchy. Saitama asked, from the center of the measurement field, whether the readings had been useful. Sessa looked at him for a long moment and said, with the plain and exhausted honesty of a being who has arrived at a conclusion that changes everything he thought he understood, that they had been the most significant readings his organization had ever produced, and that he was not yet sure what to do with them, and that he was grateful for the cooperation. Saitama said that he was glad to help, and asked whether the chamber was finished with him, because he was starting to want something to eat again. Sessa transmitted his report to the hierarchs 48 hours after the analysis chamber produced its readings, which was 48 hours of careful and deliberate preparation, because the content of the report was the kind of content that the manner of its transmission mattered as much as the information itself, and because Sessa understood, with the clarity of someone who has spent a career navigating the Covenant's complex and unforgiving institutional hierarchy, that what he was about to tell the most powerful religious authority in the known universe was going to be received as either a profound theological revelation or a profound theological crisis, and that which of those two things it became depended significantly on how he framed it. He framed it as a revelation, because that was the framing that was both more accurate and more survivable, and he built the framing around the Forerunner measurement data, which was objective and technical and difficult to dispute, and around the specific language of Covenant theological convention, which he knew well enough to use with precision, and he submitted the report, and then waited in the Forerunner installation on the southern continent of Sigma Octanus IV with the patient. Experienced composure of someone who has done everything they can do, and is now in the part of the situation that requires waiting for the world to respond. The hierarch's response took 6 days, during which the war continued with the indifferent momentum of conflicts that are too large to pause for any single development, and during which Saitama remained on Sigma Octanus IV in an arrangement that had settled into something that none of the parties involved had planned for, but that all of them had found workable. He spent time with Indigo team, who had developed with him the specific, pragmatic relationship of professionals who have worked adjacent to someone unusual and have found the adjacency more useful than strange. He spent time with Vale, who continued the series of conversations about the war that she had begun after their first meeting, and who found in those conversations a quality of honest, attentive engagement that she had not expected, and that she valued in proportion to how rare it was in her professional experience. He spent time in the Forerunner installation with Luro, who had decided that a being whose relationship to physical causality was what the measurement data described was the most significant research subject her field had ever produced, and who approached him with the focused, respectful curiosity of a scientist who has found something genuinely new, and is trying to understand it without imposing the old frameworks on it. He ate regularly, explored the installation's lower levels with the patient attention of someone who finds architecture interesting, and occasionally walked the southern continent's landscape in the early morning, when the planet's light was at a quality he found pleasant in the specific, uncomplicated way that pleasant things are pleasant when you are not expecting them to be significant. The hierarch's response arrived in Cessa's communication system on the 6th day, and was longer than any communication he had previously received from them, which itself was information before he had read the content. He read it 3 times, because the first reading was for content, and the second was for implication, and the third was for the specific language choices that Covenant hierarchical communication used to indicate which parts of a message were fixed and which were navigable. The response classified the Forerunner measurement data as a sacred finding, which was the Covenant's highest category of theological discovery, and redesignated the contact from recusant of the First Order to something that the Covenant's theological vocabulary had a term for that had never previously been applied to a living being, a term that translated approximately as witness of the margin, meaning an entity that existed at the boundary of what the Forerunner's understanding of the universe had been able to reach, and whose existence therefore indicated that the universe contained more than the Forerunner had known, which in Covenant theology was the most significant statement that could be made about any entity or phenomenon. The response also included an instruction that Cessa found, in its specificity, the most consequential part of the entire document, which was that the Covenant's military operations against human-held worlds were to be suspended in the Sigma Octanus system, pending further theological consultation with respect to the implications of the sacred finding, which was not a ceasefire and was not a peace, and was not anything that the war's strategic structure could absorb as a significant development at the level of the hierarch's broader planning, but which was a pause, and which in the context of a war that had been running without pause for years was a different kind of thing from nothing. Vale received the intelligence on the Covenant's operational suspension in the Sigma Octanus system through Prussian's monitoring of Covenant communication traffic, and processed it with the careful, analytical attention she gave to all significant intelligence, and then sat for a long time thinking about what it meant and what she should do with it, and how to represent it to the people above her in the UNSC's chain of command who were going to ask her to explain it. She went to find Saitama, who was in the installation's secondary chamber eating the morning meal that Luro's team had taken to providing for him as a matter of practical routine, and she told him what had happened and what the Covenant's response appeared to mean. He listened with the attentive, serious expression he used for information he was genuinely processing, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said that he wasn't sure he had done anything to produce that result, and that he wanted to be clear about that, because he did not want to take credit for something he had not intended. Vale said that she understood that, and that the result was real regardless of the intention, and that in her experience, the distinction between intended and unintended outcomes mattered less than people expected at the level of strategic consequence. Saitama nodded slowly and said that he hoped it was useful, and that he was going to keep thinking about what she had told him about the war, because the thinking had not produced a conclusion yet, and he had found, in his experience, that thinking without a conclusion was usually a sign that the conclusion was still forming rather than that there was no conclusion to find. He left Sigma Octanus IV 9 days later, departing in the same way he had arrived, without a clear mechanism, without a planned destination between one moment and the next. Indigo was with him when it happened, and she later described it in her after-action report as the most precise non-event she had ever documented, which was that he had been present and then he was not, and that the space he had occupied did not feel different in any way that she could identify, and that the only evidence that anything had changed was that he was gone. She stood in the secondary chamber for a moment and then opened her communication channel to Vale and said that the contact had departed, and that she did not know the mechanism or the destination. Vale acknowledged and then was quiet on the channel for longer than her usual response time, and then said that she was going to need some time before she wrote her report, and that Prussian should log the departure as uncharacterized transit pending further analysis, and that she would explain the full situation to UNSC command in whatever terms she could construct that would be useful without being incomprehensible, and that she was not yet sure what those terms were. The war did not end. Sigma Octanus IV held, which it might not have without what had happened on its northern continent and in its Forerunner installation, and the holding of a single colony world was a small thing in the context of a conflict of the scale the human Covenant war had achieved. But the Covenant's theological apparatus had been given something to process that it had not previously had: the sacred finding, the witness of the margin, the Forerunner data that Luro had transmitted to Covenant archaeological authorities through Cessa's careful management of the situation, data that said the universe contained more than the Forerunner had known, and therefore more than the Covenant's great journey had accounted for. The processing of that data through the Covenant's hierarchical and theological structure was slow and contested, and produced factions and disputes, and institutional resistance in the specific way that information which threatens a foundational framework always produces resistance in the institutions built on that framework. But it moved the way water moves through stone, not quickly, not visibly from any single vantage point, but persistently, and in a direction that the stone could not ultimately prevent. Cessa's report remained a sacred finding. Luro's data remained in the record. And the witness of the margin was gone, back to wherever the margin was, carrying with it the low, quiet warmth of having found, in the Forerunner installation's analysis chamber, the closest thing to a genuine surprise it had encountered in a very long time, and thinking about that surprise in the unfocused, patient way it thought about most things that were worth keeping, which was without urgency and without conclusion, and with the honest acknowledgement that some things were interesting in ways that didn't require resolution to remain interesting, and that this was, in its own quiet way, enough.